Well, now we stay in Cornwall, and with history in mind for our next item. Of all the activity in connection with the revival of the Cornish mining industry, none is more full of memories for the older generation than the work on trying to reopen the old Levant mine at Pendeen. For it was here, 50 years ago this year, that disaster struck, one of the worst, if not the worst, in Cornish mining history. Joe Pengelly reports.
On a desolate stretch of the North Cornish coast, just a few miles from Land's End, lie the remains of the old Levant mine. Here on October the 20th, 1919, 31 Cornish miners lost their lives when that peculiar Cornish invention, the man engine, failed.
Injury and all too often an early death were occupational hazards of the Cornish tin and copper miners, but fortunately major disasters were few and far between.
They were lucky to get any survivors out at all. It was like a butcher's shop.
Many women were left with large families.
One chap, he was hanging upside down, in the shaft. A father and a son, they were found, and the son was lying across his father. His father was dead, and he is still living.
Because it was nearly somebody from every home. If it wasn't a son or a son-in-law, it was a brother or uncle or something,
A terrible tragedy for this little mining community. It's pretty common knowledge that the cause was the failure of what they called the man engine. You've actually been down what remains of the mine, Joe, and talked to some of the miners who were involved in the disaster. Can you describe this man engine?
Well, Ross, first of all, you've got to appreciate that these Cornish mines were pretty deep. The Levant mine, in fact, even had a submarine shaft that ran a mile out under the sea. And from the entrance on top of the cliffs, the miners had to descend some 2,000 feet. That's very much more than, say, the height of the Eiffel Tower or even the Empire State Building. Up until the 1850s, miners in Cornwall had to climb up and down dozens of ladders, a tremendous physical effort which took about an hour and a half each day.
And do a strenuous day's work down the mine as well.
Exactly. And that's why the mine owners were desperate to find some sort of mechanical conveyance which would fit into the narrow shaft which had been cut into the solid rock from the head of the mine to the workings 1,600 feet below.
What they did was to adapt the famous Cornish pumping engine, wasn't it?
Well, the same principle, yes. Basically, what they did in 1857 at Levant was to make use of the up and down motion of the beam of the Cornish pumping engine, which moved like a seesaw. To one end of it they connected a wooden beam, or rod as it was called, some 9 inches square, and this reached right down to the bottom of the mine. On the rod was a metal step, big enough for one man to stand on, at intervals of every 12 feet down the rod. 12 feet because that was exactly how far the rod was lowered and raised with each stroke of the Cornish pumping engine. Then on the sides of the shaft, also at 12-foot intervals, they built small wooden platforms, or sollers as they call them in Cornwall.
Yes, I get the idea. So a man stood on the moving step while it went down 12 feet, and then he stepped off onto the solid platform on the opposite side of the shaft. He waited there for a few moments until the next step on the moving rod came up to his level. He stepped onto that and went down another 12 feet and so on to the bottom.
That's it, and the procedure in reverse when he wanted to come up to the surface again.
An ingenious idea, but 1,600 feet is a tremendous depth. I would have thought it a bit hazardous with the full weight of dozens of miners on it at the end of the day's work. Claustrophobic too in the narrow parts of the rock shaft.
Well, looking back, you'd be right about it being hazardous. Even in 1914, a commission on mines officially described the man engine at Levant as a survival from the past, and in fact drew up some special rules governing its use.
Well, it's been in a very bad condition for years. Should never have been used for the previous 50 years. That's in my opinion. Lots of men wouldn't work down Levant because they were afraid of that. Scores of men, miners, they would go there because they was afraid of the man engine.
That was Mr. Simmons. He was one of the miners. Mrs. Murley, one of the surviving widows, remembers what her husband said.
I did notice my husband and another miner that lived a few doors away were talking a week or two before the accident happened, and they were saying about the man engine and that it was creaking and they didn't like it, and they kept saying they think something is going to really happen seriously if it wasn't something done by it.
Mrs. Mary Davy was a child at the time, but she remembers vividly the warnings expressed by her father.
I do remember my father saying, I heard him say this to my mother in our home, it will come together like a basket one day. And she said to him, then why do you work there? Why do you stay there? Of course, as always, that's the only industry. There was nothing else he could do, apart from going abroad. I do remember those words he said about the mine coming together like a basket, which it did when the man engine broke away. The moment it started hitting the sides, as far as I can gather, that was the trouble. The whole thing collapsed.
And this is exactly what did happen. At 2:50 p.m. on Monday, October the 20th, 1919, when the man engine was almost fully loaded with over 100 miners coming off shift, the top of the man engine broke away from its connection with the engine, and the rod plunged back with its cargo of miners down through the shaft. To make matters worse, the top of the rod itself broke 360 feet down from the surface, and with its load of 30 men plummeted another 300 feet. There was a great roar and showers of sparks as the metal steps ricocheted from side to side of the narrow granite shaft. Mr. Semmons, who lost a brother in the disaster, was actually on the man engine at the time.
I was on the man engine when it broke, one step above the 150 level. I felt the engine quiver, and I jumped and caught all the bell wire and put my end under a piece of timber. In the meantime, the step on above me came down with a man on it. He wasn't dirt. And we walked up, and we didn't know there was any such thing happened until we got up to 60 level, and there we saw the mine captain, Captain Arthur Puckenarn. And we asked him, was everything all right up here? And he said, all right. He said, there's some shape in here. Nearly half the men from the halfway up was either killed or injured. A father and the son, they were found, and the son was lying across his father. His father was dead, and he is still living, that chap. Well, I went into 60, and there's some sites there. One chap, he got a brewer, he suffered a lot. He was hanging upside down, in the shaft. A pitiful sight that was. Well, he did go a bit barmy, come to the last. They got him out alive, but he died shortly after. Some of them, but I don't know how to say this, were sent up in bags, Parts of them, lots of them thought they buried their own, but they buried parts of the other men. I went up the level then, and went up the top. And when I heard that my brother was in it, I felt a bit upset.
Above ground was Mr. John Willie Thomas, one of the many rescuers.
Well, there was utter confusion. There were women and men from all over the parish, from every point of the parish.
Because the man engine shaft was blocked, Mr. Thomas had to climb down the cliff face and enter the mine through some old workings almost at sea level.
The scene that met my eyes was the shape the shaft was in, and everything was all crisscross, timber, iron, well, indescribable. Yes, and to put it matter, the shaft was swept clear. We see all the debris had come through the shaft, timber, parts of the rod. They were lucky to get any survivors out at all. My own cousin, he was in the shaft for, I think, 50 hours before they took him out. He's called Nicholas Ockham Thomas. And I think myself personally, he had a hard death. You could hear him for hours and hours and hours. And when they took him out from here, well, there was breath in the body then. Pity too, but there he went. It was only, he didn't, no crushing or, he wasn't bone broke, only had a bit of mark on his eye, that's all.
Back down in the mine was Mr. Hosking.
On the 20th of October 1919, we were working about a mile under the sea with two blacksmiths. And when we'd done our duty, we came back, and I went on the foam and foamed to the surface. And the captain of the mine told us that the man engine had broken down, and we should have to walk up. But whatever we do not walk up through the man engine shaft, but the pump shaft, which we did. And of course, as we travelled up the shaft and got up 100 fathom from the surface, we was told that a small disaster had happened. But when we got up to 60, we saw there 8 or 9 men that were put in bags. And there's one man there that was 6'2", I knew him quite well, and he was put in a sack that would hold about an underweight of potatoes. And it was a great job for the men to recognize who was their husbands or their sons or their brothers or cousins. But I think that the men at that time of Giever Mine and Levant Mine did a wonderful job in restoring and recognizing the bodies of those who lost their lives on the 20th of October 1919.
I imagine that losing 31 men in such a small community as St. Just and Pendeen must have been absolutely horrifying.
Oh, it was. Mrs. Davy, whom we heard from just now, has very vivid memories of what the disaster did to St. Just.
Groups of people standing around and women standing in doorways, stunned. They had a stunned look on their face. They were shocked. It was unbelievable that it could happen to us.
Mrs. Murley, in her 20s at the time of the disaster, was the youngest of the widows.
It was something terrible. You know, I mean, didn't matter where you go, they said you would see little fatherless children and the women in, well, it must have been in a terrible state. Of course, I being in the condition I wasn't able to get up hardly from the chair for 2 months. And I lived on brandy and milk. Because, you see, my baby was expected in 2 months, and they thought the baby would have been born that night. Of course, that meant that I was really an invalid till after, and my son was born on Boxing Night. His daddy was buried the 26th of October, and he was born the 26th of December. Of course, I wasn't out to see anything, but I've heard them say it was terrible in the town. And the atmosphere wherever you went, you see, was terrible. And it happened a week, or was it a fortnight, before our feast. And it was a terrible thing here, they said, that it put such a damp on the place, you see. And it was no feast for St. Just that year, because it was nearly somebody from every home. If it wasn't a son or a son-in-law, it was a brother or uncle or something, you know. So it was a terrible time, terrible thing.
Cornish miners, cousin Jacks, all over the world contributed thousands of pounds to a relief fund, but apparently the administrators of the fund were pretty tight-fisted.
Well, you see, we had to wait till things were straightened out before you'd get anything for you to live on, really, because they had just I think they must have had just a small fund that they were taken from to tide us over until things were settled. And that, I think that happened, well, it did happen in October, and I think we was in next September or October before we got any compensation or anything. Of course, the money was all put in the bank, you see, and I've had to come and go to the bank for all these years, once a fortnight, for my money. Of course, I will say we got more money now, but when my children was small, times was very tight. They were like as if they were afraid to pay the money out. In fact, I wanted £100 to buy the house to have a shelter for the children, and they wouldn't grant it. You see. There was, I couldn't tell you how many thousands of pounds in Africa and every part where the Cornish man was sent home for the dependents. And we're given to understand there's thousands there that'll never be spent. But they've amalgamated, I think, with other mining, which shouldn't have never been done, they said. So they're giving us more now. And, of course, we can all do with more, we know, but it's when my children was small that I felt the pinch very badly. It was the tough times, really, you know.
There was mourning and weeping for a very, very long time. Very, very bad indeed. And it seemed that a dark cloud was hanging over St. Just. And then they used to sing on the mansion a great deal, but after the disaster it ceased for some weeks, and then it began again. One of the men said, "Let us sing the old songs again," and we started.
Sweet is the work, my God, my King, to praise thy name, give thanks
I got interested in the Levant disaster because my great-grandfather was a Cornish miner. He was a blacksmith at Mary Wheel Mine in Menheniot. And so I suddenly came across this book by Joe Pengelly, which described this very dramatic disaster, one of the greatest of all that Cornwall had experienced. But more so, I became interested in the disaster fund. With 31 miners being given the benefit of £31,000 recorded worldwide, I was amazed at the parsimony with which that fund was administered. 31,000, there was £1,000 for each of the miners involved, a vast sum for miners in far west Cornwall of that time. What is interesting is that because it was doled out so parsimoniously, there was a local fund which was never acknowledged because the residents of St. Just, they didn't touch the bankers. They were mean. To their credit, when 50 years on, the £31,000 that had been raised officially was still there, and all they'd done was to have paid out on the interest. But as Mrs. Murley has said, they had to wait 12 months before there was any means by which they could sustain themselves and their families. So I think that's an interesting aspect of Cornishmen, that they do things on their own. The Levant disaster had this affinity to the 1939 lifeboat disaster in St.Ives. Now, in that case, there was a considerable amount of money raised, but it was all distributed immediately. Yet within 12 months or so, the widows were coming back to the administrators of the fund. Why didn't you dole it out like the people at Levant did? You could have looked after it and we shouldn't be penniless again. What was very ironic at the time of the disaster, that in the dry, where there was great wailing and sobbing and crying, somebody fell into the submerged pool which they used for their washing purposes after they'd come out of the mine. And for just a few moments, that dramatic time when everybody was thinking about the dead, somebody fell into the pool and everybody burst out laughing, and it broke the atmosphere, but it didn't last for long.
Very few Cornishmen need an excuse to burst into song, and Cornish male voice choirs have earned for themselves a worldwide reputation, and so it was in days gone by. Christmas time, for example, provided a fine opportunity for an impromptu sing-song in the most unusual places, as Willie Warren and Billy Waters told me.
Best carols I used to hear was down Levant in them days when I was a boy. Yes. And there was an old man, he had a lovely voice, a baritone singer. He used to live down Metallic, called John Lug. And he used to be the choir master boy.
Well, he's the man that started them up, see.
Yes. But I shall never forget them days.
No.
And you could hear them going up, boy, coming up through Mannion Shaft, you know. Lovely carols.
Oh, yes, good
The
carols.
same carols we have here now, Christmas Day.
I know, yes.
Yes, the old ones.
Well, you can't beat the old carols, can you?
I don't think you can.
Well, I know you can. I mean, you take the old Zenner carols, there's no prettier under the sun. And if they don't play them on the BBC and things like that, I don't know.
It's all pop stuff now. The Cornish choir in America to sing them. Yeah. Grass Valley Choir.
When they used to have carols singing at the Levant mine, did they used to sing these underground?
Underground, start off down 266. That's the bottom of the main engine shaft. And they'd sing all the way up. They used to start before the engine starts. See, the engine used to always start Avasto, sometimes a bit later than others. But that was the time, Avasto. But they'd always wait for John Lug to start up their carol.
Yes.
Because John Lug was a grand old
Well, he could start the right notes, see.
Oh, lovely voice, lovely voice.
See, he had the right pitch, see.
Oh, lovely voice, lovely.
Sound handsome. Hear them, that sound coming up through the shaft, boy, is beautiful.
Boys joined in, see.
Everybody joined in.
Well, they could sing would join in.
Well, if it didn't, they say, well...
But they couldn't sing. Well, they had to shut up like a bus in a drone, they used to say. No good. Like somebody said, like a train gone off the track.
Is that right, Willie?
I worked in Levant about 3 years. Levant was much smaller scale than this. The level was smaller, lower. Here again, you could hardly compare it with Giver, not today. I went to Levant for 3 years after the disaster.
About 1922?
And I was there until they closed it down.
So they were already running it down, were they, when you joined the mine?
Yeah.
You said that Levant was rather different to Giver.
The Levant mine was a very hot mine. The farther you went down, the hotter it was. You could say from 278 level to the bottom was very hot. But as you came up, of course, the temperature was lower as you came to the top.
Did you actually go out under the sea?
Yes, I went under the sea. All the levels run seaward on Levant.
Did it ever worry you?
No, not a bit. I don't think it worried anyone down there. I was thinking they used to forget all about it once you get in there.
You never had any fear the sea would come in?
No, we thought nothing about the sea at all. Nothing. You should enter your head, I think, just like here. Once you get underground, just your job, and that was it. You forget all about everything else.
But they say you could hear it.
Well, I've heard that too. But, I've heard it on a Sunday when everything is quiet on the 40 level. But below that, I never heard it myself.
Was it true that in the old days they used to sing a lot down there?
Yes, sing, but never whistle.
What did you used to sing?
Anything. Doesn't matter. Of day there was no pop, but you could sing a hymn if you wanted to.
Must have sounded rather good in that rather cavernous place.
Everything is enclosed in, and the voices would sound, when you're in the shaft, several times, it would sound all right. But some of the Cornish people are good singers. Yeah. That doesn't include me, of course.
You're retiring in 2 weeks' time. What will you like to remember best?
Oh, first thing I think is the crowd of men I work with. I think they're a grand lot of men. They're a happy lot of men, and they're a good lot of men, hard-working, very friendly, and I think the people that come here from the outside get on with them very well.
When Mr. Stevens just now was saying what a marvellous lot of workmates he had, he was being heavily prompted by Jim next door. Jim, what does it mean being a safety officer?
Well, we've got a set of rules laid out for safety here in the mine, and you'll always find some people who do try to cut corners, especially contractors and things like this, you know. People using explosives, bad ground, working under bad ground rather than go and take it down, things like that, you know.
But you'd say it's much safer here now than it used to be.
Well, we are a lot stricter now on safety. We don't leave it go to the people themselves to take their own initiative. We try to enforce these, try to get people to do the right thing, you know.
What would you say about the spirit of Giver Mine?
No, I think it's very good. I think people get very good wages. I think that's what to keep the spirit up now more than anything, don't it? Different from what it used to be when I started here, when Tommy and me started here 35. We used to get about 6 bob a day. There's another shift boss here. He'd been here quite a long time working. Is Richard Eddy.
You started when?
When I was 14-year-old, at 10 shilling a week on the surface.
Was this usual that when you started as a boy, you started on the surface and then worked your way down, as it were?
Worked your way down. And I came down underground when I was 21, at 4 and 3 a day, tramming. I've been in some old mines. I've been in the Bellin mine St. Just, which is all workings, and well, mining the same for years through. Whereas all in the ground, you find a Cornishman like a rabbit, and he'd say for happy digging.
They tell me too that they're very often pigeon fanciers. How does this come to be so?
Well, you know, I'm a pigeon fancier.
Well, we get told things by people, you see.
They are, see, yes. I'm training them now, and hope on Saturday you may see them flying over Red in Plymouth.
But do many miners do this?
Yes, quite a few of the boys in the mine are pigeons. Yeah, have for years. Gotta have something when you're up on surface for a bit of a hobby.
That's the main hobby, is it then? Is music at all one of the hobbies people in the mine?
Music and soccer, any sport. The boys are in for all kinds of sport.
Do you have your own football team?
Yes, Pendine. Giver have a football team as well.
So the comradeship above the ground is as strong as that down here?
Yes, they're all boys together. We all live happy together and breathe the same air together.
We're back today at Giver, where in the 60s they did a marvellous mining exercise, which I think had it been done anywhere else would have hit the world headlines and retained them for a very long time. By 1960, Geaver had realised that to obtain further ore reserves, they had to go westward, which meant following their loads out under the sea. And the problem, of course, was Levant, which was next door and which was flooded. And the mines inspectorate had drawn a line on the map beyond which Geaver couldn't go.
Flooded as a result of prospecting too close to the surface of the seabed, I think,
That's
years
it.
ago.
Yes, that is so, yes. And the sea broke in, which I will mention later on. But in 1959, they decided to reopen Levant, and when they investigated skip shaft, they found that the water in the shaft was rising and falling with the tide. That meant one thing: the sea was in. So in 1960, it was decided to find out where it was coming in. And they put some dye down the shaft, and in 2 or 3 days, a nice green patch appeared well out in the sea on that coast of North Cornwall. And that was at a position known to be above what was called the 40 backs. That's where the 40 fathom load had gone up from the 40 fathom level, and the old men had worked it up so close to the seabed that when they were up there they could hear the boulders rolling to and fro.
Dangerously close.
Very too close for comfort, yes.
But the sea didn't come in while they were there.
No, the sea didn't come in, and that came about after the mine had closed. So divers were sent down and located the breach. And it would be too time-consuming and difficult to explain everything that happened and how they decided to solve the problem. But work began in 1961, and by the end of the year, they'd plugged the hole with concrete, made a reinforced concrete raft over the plug, and everything looked fine. So it was left to settle and cure during the winter.
That's when I first realised in my youthful ignorance that concrete would set underwater when I read that story.
That's it, yes. And skip shaft was rehabilitated to enable the mine to be unwatered. By July 1962, the water level had been reduced. Then, and you may imagine the disbelief, dismay, and horror when they found that in skip shaft the water was rising and falling with the tide again. So divers had to go down, and they found that there was a hole about 8 feet under the raft. The sea had worked its way in there again under the concrete mat. So again, under the sea, it became necessary to blast that raft and blast until they found solid rock all the way around the hole, which was now about 50 by 20 feet. So this had taken until late 1962. On this, of course, a reappraisal was absolutely necessary because it was a most expensive exercise and new plans had to be prepared, and this took until autumn 1964. And success was ultimately achieved.
Tremendously difficult feat, I'm sure.
It was. It was a marvellous feat.
We're 150 feet above the sea at the moment at the old Levant mine workings, hanging precariously on the edge of the cliff. Now, I believe, Mr. Gilbert, that these days Geaver is actually connected to Levant. Is that right?
Yes, we are connected through to Levant on what is Geavor's 14th level and Levant's 6th level.
Why did you connect through?
The connection was made, first of all, to facilitate the dewatering of the old Levant workings, and then afterwards to provide a ready access to the new crosscut, which we all felt had to be put out to really to examine some of the older workings out in the Botallock area.
So Botallock being yet further south from Geaver than Levant?
That is so.
So you've gone right through the Levant workings into the Botallock workings?
Right through Levant workings into Botallock area.
But of course Levant has been disused for many years.
Oh, Levant closed in 1931 in the then Depression.
You said you had to dewater it. Does this mean the old Levant workings were full of water?
Levant was full of water up to, when we went into Levant, up to the sea level. But obviously before that, before the sea actually broke into Levant workings, Levant must have been flooded to the adit level, which is sitting about 50 feet above sea level.
Why was this?
The old mine would have been flooded by water coming from the landward side of the mine. So the water level would have been built up above sea level. This leads to the supposition that it was the reverse pressure of the landward water that actually broke out into the sea in the end.
So there was actually a connection to the sea?
Oh yes, very much so. It was a connection that measured at one stage 40 feet long by 20 feet wide after we'd cleaned it out.
How far out did it turn out to be, looking at...
About 500 feet from this cliff edge on which we're standing at the moment.
Now these are notoriously very rough waters. Did you have very much difficulty in filling up this breach?
Oh, very much so. In fact, one attempt did fail, and it was only at the second attempt in 1965 that a successful sealing was put into the breach. Even this took quite some considerable time because we had to wait for 6 months for the sea to calm down sufficiently to enable the boat to anchor off in a suitable position.
But how can you possibly fill a breach which is under the sea in rough water 500 feet off the cliffs?
We had a network of reinforcing down on the seabed inside this breach hole. We were able to introduce the sand cement grout right down into the inside of the breach, and this was built up in layers in 3 successive injections until we finally achieved this 10-foot thick reinforced concrete plug.
It's like a great concrete cork.
Like a great concrete cork, yes. After we had the breach sealed off properly, we took the water level down even further, and then over many, many months after this worked underground at laying a reinforced concrete floor and a wall inside the mine further to consolidate the breach area.
Does this mean that the old Levant workings under the sea are now sealed off completely?
The old workings are completely sealed off from the rest of the mine. There is no hazard whatsoever now.
I wonder, is there any superstition remaining in the minds of some miners these days about going into the old Levant workings again?
We did have some apprehension, first of all, when we effected the holing from Givor's 14th level, but some of our more experienced miners did go into Levant and were able to inspect for themselves the work that had been done to consolidate the area. They could see the watertight door on the 14th level, and they came out perfectly happy that there was no longer any hazard.
This whole operation, which we've condensed into about 3 minutes, was quite a triumph for you, wasn't it? Quite a precedent almost for mining in this country.
In terms of mining engineering, I think the way in which Mr. Batchelor, who was then the manager of the mine, the way in which he conducted this operation is entirely unique.
So a triumphant moment when you realized the waters were going down and you'd
Very
sealed the
much
breach.
a triumphant moment.
Do you see a prosperous future for tin mining generally in Cornwall?
If you refer to some of the statements that have been made by the chairman of the various companies, right now the prospect is not particularly bright. But recently we have had an increase in the price of tin, and provided that the price of tin does get back to a realistic level, yes, there is a great future in tin mining.
So in spite of all the prospecting that's gone on over the last, 200 years in Cornwall, there's still plenty down there to get out.
There is still plenty down there to get out, but it needs a realistic tin price to make it economic to get it out.
Writers often attach a lot of romantic association with mines in this area particularly. How romantic an industry do you think it is?
I don't regard mining as a romantic industry at all. It's hard work. Our miners, who are relatively well paid, really earn their money. There's a lot of sweat and quite a lot of toil, and sometimes some tears.
Well, basically we can take you underground 2,100 feet and at least a quarter of a mile under the sea.
You notice your ears in that blocking up, that is a change in atmospheric pressure. All you got to do is either yawn or swallow. We do not serve any boiled sweets as I do at Pan Am or TWA. We're a poor mine.
Can anyone go underground?
No, only those over 14 and, well, they really should be quite fit because it can take 3.5 hours and that's quite a lot of walking.
Bit rigorous, is it?
No, not really. Brave and fearless people go all the time.
Now at this point we're now leaving the United Kingdom and journeying out underneath the Atlantic Ocean. As I indicated before, you won't need any passports. We don't have any passport control down here, but we will be visiting our duty-free shop a little later on. As you can see, the surrounding rock is very, very dry. It's probably the driest that you've ever been underwater.
We understand we're the only working mine in Northern Europe that'll actually take people underground, but we have to fulfil a number of safety measures, obviously, and as long as we abide by them, then the Inspector of Mines will let us go ahead.
We are now down on 19 levels, some 2,100 feet below the surface, and also a good way out under the Atlantic Ocean. I can recall my uncle telling me in years gone by, when he worked on Levant, that you could stand on the upper levels underground, just as we're doing now, and you could hear the rocks rolling around on the seabed. You could also hear the waves breaking up against the cliffs in particularly bad sea conditions, wherever they had rough weather. If you look down that rope race, you can see the bottom of the shaft. That is down at 20 levels, some 125 feet down below us, and that is probably the closest you'll ever get to Australia.
What sort of people come?
Well, mostly those interested in the heritage side of Cornish history. Obviously those interested in mining. A lot of people come on holiday just to go underground, but they tend to be people who've been in mines all over the country and all over the world.
This to you and I suppose you would call this a shovel or a spade. As you well know, a Cornishman never calls a spade a spade. This has got its own terminology. I don't know if you know what it is. Maybe the way that I'm holding it might give you a bit of a clue. That's correct. That's a banjo.
Another interesting feature underground at Giever was a sub-incline shaft. It was completed in 1979 to take miners from 15 level in the Victory shaft down into the old Levant minings by a slanting shaft. It took them down to 18 level. Her Majesty the Queen unveiled a plaque to open that shaft in 1980, and I was able to follow in her footsteps or along the tramway in a tram with mining historian John Brock.
Bit different from the old man engine, John.
It's very different from the man engine, yes. This is really modern transport underground, isn't it?
Just like an underground railway in London or anywhere.
It is, yes, and all nicely lit with electric light. Fancy coming up in a man engine with a candle in your hat and a yawning chasm beneath you.
I wonder how long the man engine would have taken them to get from the depths where we are. It's like 2,000 feet to the surface.
Well, at Levant it did 5 strokes a minute and a 12-foot stroke. That would be 60 feet per minute. So that would be about just over 30 minutes.
And this will take about 5.
Yes, not that, I don't expect. And in very comfortable conditions.
The price of tin at the present time is somewhere just above £6,200 per tonne, which is very encouraging, and we're keeping our fingers crossed and hoping to get back to a full workforce and once again making good profits.
We're standing in this splendidly restored engine house, Bill. It's as good as new, I would say.
Well, yes, the National Trust spent something like £12,000 putting a new roof on, new timbers, but all in the traditional style. Delaware Stantle slate, lime rich mortar, and lime wash on the walls, and it is as it would have been when it was built.
And the thing that amazes me, the engine still here in the house, intact, well, pretty well intact, you were telling me, from the day that the mine closed in 1930.
The mine closed in 1930, and the engine was abandoned then, and it was saved from the scrap merchants by the then Cornish Engines Preservation Committee, which is now named the Trevithick Society. The engine began life in 1840 and, like grandfather's clock, ran for 90 years. She had a runaway in the 1880s and the flywheel burst and quite a bit of damage, so it was rebuilt. The flywheel now is probably a local built one, and it had new valve gear put in, and we have only just discovered that the engine is not a 24-inch, that is, the cylinder diameter is not 24-inch, as all the books say. It is in fact 27. Which explains one or two other queer things about the engine, because the beam is not quite dead centre. So we presume they put the larger cylinder in after the breakaway, when the engine driver lost There's concentration, and the engine gains speed, and the flywheel burst and disappeared through the roof.
It's interesting, very few people, I think, will know just how big an engine such as this is within the engine house. We all know what the engine houses look like, the ruins are all over Cornwall, but here we see from the inside that the engine really does fill the house, doesn't it? It's a massive beam. How long is that?
Well, the beam is about 15 feet long, but in Cornish engine standards, it's really quite a small one. And as you say, it is all in-house. The beam is balancing or pivoted along that massive wooden cross beam, which in most Cornish engines would be the bob wall. So this end of the beam would be actually out of doors. And here, of course, it's all inside because it is a small engine, and it is really in a very exposed position on the edge of the cliff. And it would be very drafty, I suppose, if half the engine was outside.
You say it's a small engine, but here we are up at the level of the beam in the top of the house, heads almost touching the roof above us, and we're looking down, 15, 20 feet to the floor of the engine. That down there, that seat is where the engine man would have operated.
Yes, the engine man sat there. He would have an indicator on the wall opposite, which would tell him where the skip was in the shaft, because this was the engine that wound all the ore up from Levant mine. And to his right there's a little fireplace where he could warm his pasty and have a brew up, a little fireplace which sent its smoke into the main chimney stack. And in front of him he would have the brake wheel and the throttle lever and the pedals to operate the valve gear to set the engine in motion forward or backwards. And of course down below that floor there's another level where there's the hot well and the condenser. So there's another 15 feet below that floor down there.
How long before we see it all in motion again?
Well, we're hoping to put the engine in motion for its 150th anniversary next year on compressed air. And if she works on compressed air, then there's no reason why she won't work on steam. And what a grand occasion that would be to have a Harvey-built engine working steam. There are Cornish engines working in other parts of the world, but not in Cornwall, and it would be a grand thing to have this working.
And do you think that'll happen?
I'm sure it will happen. The lads who are working on here, Milton Thomas and his men, call themselves the Greasy Gang. They've been working Fridays and Saturdays for years, doing some tremendous work. One chap has come down all the way from Bedford, comes down at weekends and mends parts and takes bits away to fettle in his workshop. All the enthusiasm that's gone into it, I'm sure will be rewarded.
A couple of months ago here on Coast to Coast, we told you of a remarkable achievement, an achievement which in this industrial heritage year would really put Cornwall on the map. After 60 years of neglect and the ravages of time and weather, the Levant mine winding engine on the cliff top near Pendine had been restored to life, and we brought you sweet sounds of steam to prove it. Now the National Trust has announced the official opening of the engine house to the public. They've coordinated an appeal which has raised £160,000. But raising steam again was the number one priority of the Trevithick Society's volunteer Greasy Gang. Led by Camborne boy Milton Thomas, it was an 8-year task.
Over the years, when we look back at what has been accomplished, at the photographs which we did at the time, and look at those photographs now and see the end product of this machine in motion, I must say, I've always said it myself, it has been an outstanding project.
And with all the salt in the air, it must be tremendously corroded.
That is right.
Lord Falmouth taking a great interest in the engine, as well he might. As a gentleman miner, he owns the mineral rights across a large area of Cornwall. He was there to inaugurate the steaming, and by golly, it was hotter than steam in the National Trust's marquee. Perched on the edge of the cliff, dignitaries felt able to identify with the problems encountered by the Greasy Gang.
Nothing is easy at Levant. This fact was again proved when, after assembling the steam inlet pipe and the 5 steam valves, Courtney Row, St. Milton, I have to tell you, they dropped the Stanley knife down the steam pipe.
Fortunately, all obstructions had been removed from the steam pipe, ready for this VIP-type steaming. Yes, after all the years of blood, sweat and tears and choice language now and again, the Cornish boys had to be on their best behaviour. Boiler-suited Willie Alford asked the Sunday-suited Lord if he was ready to open the steam cock.
Is everything all right?
Yeah.
Let's go.
And yes, the 27-inch diameter piston rose and the 12-foot flywheel began to turn.
Tremendous.
How was that?
Great relief all round, but the real VIP of the day was this 150-year-old engine breathing new life. The steam buffs will all tell you they have personalities of their own, these engines. And that's not all. Peter Hawkins of Wheelmartin China Clay Museum and the former owner of the Romney Hythe and Dymchurch Railway.
Well, I wouldn't have missed this for all the world. Just to get this wonderful whiff of the past. There is no substitute for the sounds and smells of saturated steam and oil.
The engine hauled skips up and down the shaft 1,140 feet deep at 400 feet per minute. But should we get too excited? How does it compare with some of the great Cornish engines? Jim Hodge of the Trevithick Society.
It's one of the smaller ones. It's only a 20-odd inch diameter cylinder, but it's one of the oldest ones. It's the oldest one still in existence. And, of course, it's connected with a very historic mine and a wonderful site. So it's in itself a wonderful thing, but it's also an example of what can be done and what sort of attractions we can arrange in Cornwall. We can do a great deal more of this, which will do Cornwall far more good than all the catch-penny tourist things that exist at the moment.
It's hoped the Levant engine will attract people from all over the world. After all, the experts point out, steam began here in Cornwall, and we should coordinate and promote all our valuable sites, including the Giever Mine Museum, which is shortly to be opened by the Cornwall County Council. The Trevithick Trust aims to pull together the various strands. Its newly appointed chief executive is Stuart Smith, former director of Ironbridge. Could Levant rival that in future?
Not on its own, because when we put together the whole range of sites which we have in industrial Cornwall, and I'm not talking about mining sites, there are other sites which are of great interest, which are related to transport, to ports and harbours, to telecommunications. When these all get linked together, then we have something which is definitely deserving of World Heritage Site status, and yes, it could rival Ironbridge, particularly as it's such a phenomenal educational resource in such a wonderful area.
World Heritage Site status. Yes, that's the aim, and all as a result of the simple aim of Milton Thomas and his greasy gang, who just wanted to get the wheels turning.
I think he's really enjoyed it.
Vera Thomas is the wife of the man who for 8 years came home grafted in Greece. She has only one worry now that the task is done.
I don't know what he's going to do. No, I don't, honestly, I don't know what he's going to do. He'll have to get another mine, and then we can start on that then.
Mining and streaming in St. Just goes back to prehistoric days, and the area of Giever was said by Norden to be working in about 1585, so that the reign of the first Queen Elizabeth, and here we are trying to save it in the reign of Elizabeth II. The present Giever Company was formed in 1911, and until today has been the last mine in the St. Just area where over 50 mines have worked. So I feel very sad about the position.
What can the future be?
Well, at the present time, the price of tin doesn't justify, well, other than very, very modest mining. But South Crofty is keeping going, as you know, and just ticking over profitably. But a viable, well-presented tourist attraction would certainly provide cash for the time being and give the mine a chance to survive by keeping the underground workings dry, so that when the tin price went up and it became viable again, the mine was ready to reopen. And there are many thousands of tons of broken ore underground now ready to be brought up. But of course, at the moment, the price doesn't justify it down there.
It's a very difficult time to be encouraging anyone to open up what would effectively be a new tourist attraction, isn't it? We heard on the programme that
Yes.
they were down in their takings, all the tourist attractions
Everywhere,
this year.
yes. And yet the Giever takings have been up this year on the tourist side, because it is a one-off, really, you know. I think people do get something special about going 1,500 feet down. But nonetheless, efforts have been going on very, very strenuously by so many people at all levels to try to save the mine, and that is that mine now is, of course, part of Levant mine, which is equally famous, so you're really steeped in mining history. But recently, as you said, the pumps were stopped, and the water has now come up to 16 level. That pump chamber on 19 that you went in is now underwater, and 15, where that, do you remember that lovely pump chamber with the salt water and freshwater pumps?
Oh yes, because it is below sea level.
Yes, but there again, now 15 is the vital one, and if the water reaches 15, then that pump station becomes submerged, and the mine comes to a very untimely end. So time is running very short. Efforts are being made in every direction to try to save it, but finance is the problem, and yet we seem to get finance for so many things, and yet this, which would provide employment, proves a stumbling block.
What sort of finance is wanted?
Oh, say £300,000 or £400,000.
To do what?
To keep the pumps going, and to make the mine attractive as a tourist attraction, make it a first-class one, and then keep it unwatered so that when tin price comes back, as it will, I wouldn't like to say when, then it's there and mining can start. If anybody's got any suggestions, I'd be glad to hear them and pass them on. But of course, my worry is that it would be a great help to the economy of the county, and particularly of St. Just. The economy of St. Just has been involved with mining, and more particularly too, we are losing the hereditary skills of miners, which has been one of the best assets and exports of Cornwall.
Well, of course, letters have gone even to the Queen, I think, and to the government.
Yes.
Has there been any, well, positive response?
Not yet. No. This is sad.
The mines in Cornwall closed down one by one. The Cornish miner was left with no other alternative but to seek his fortune abroad, where his skills were in great demand in the developing countries of Australia, Canada, America, South Africa, and Mexico. No matter where you go in the world, they used to say, look down a hole and you will find a Cornishman at the bottom of it. Willie Rowan and Billy Waters can remember when horse-drawn buses used to leave St. Just, carrying miners with all their personal belongings contained in large leather trunks bound in copper.
Every Friday they used to go away in the bus. Yes. You see the bus going on every Friday, but you see a trunk up on them.
Oh, yes,
you know them old trunks they used to wear.
Leather around them.
Cover around them too. All bound in cover. Cover plate. Strong. I used to go for them back for years,
yes. Well, worth a back then, one of them bloody trunks. Worth a back then.
I wish I could get a hold of one of those trunks.
This is what they used to carry their stuff in.
Yes.
Carry everything. Spells. Never used to take the spells with them. You don't know what spells are, don't you?
No, I don't.
Well, that's why you come here, damn, and don't understand their language. You don't know what a spell is.
What is a spell?
Bill, come on.
Boat. We are the mine. Underground. Don't see none now. Don't see none. Good books too. I don't know, 7 and 6 I suppose newspaper on them.
You couldn't get it swelled, the boot, there's not for that one, because there's 100 iron and steel on it.
Well, bit. Oh, you tell them, You used to have steel cubes and toll heads, on boats. Steel.
I know we went out to Al Cornish showed once, and Al Hoskin was out there. You know Al, blacksmith. In comes Tom Holla. Hello, Tom, he said, what's the matter? Oh, he said, I want cubes and tool plates, boy. You used to go blacksmith then, he wanted them, you know.
I know that is.
And Al said, I'll fix you with them another Tom. And we had them there already made.
Yes.
And as he comes here, Tom puts it in against the wall, and Al threw his boot up, just like Siewn Parker. Fixed them now, and he said, I think his pair will do for you, Tom. He nailed the buckets up with these boots on. I said, Tom, they didn't nail. Al said, no, they went penetrated feet. But Tom, he got his head in against the wall now, and Al took a foot of them up and between his legs, just like a banged his bloody toe plates and killed him, you know. And we got up and stood up. He said, all right, I'll come to what I owe you. I don't know. Father, he said, I'm all right now for the winter. See the sparks flying when they walk down the road. If you took your tub plate or your wheel on the road, you see sparks flying all over.
Surely what they had.